Chapter 7. Now it is commonly believed that chapter 7 is that chapter which defines the 12th step and is that chapter which we will turn to for directions on being a sponsor. And in part that's true, but there is much about the 12th step which is not included in chapter 7. And as a result of that, it's kind of important for us to first understand what the 12th step is and what is not going to be defined in this chapter, and then we'll look at what the chapter does address itself to, and extremely well, as a matter of fact. First of all, the 12th step is a step which begins with this what amounts to a great promise that we will have a spiritual awakening as the result of working the 12 steps. Historically, the 12th step, as originally written by Bill Wilson, did not mention spiritual awakening. The term he used was spiritual experience, which is the term that appears all the way through the Big Book. If you remember back in chapter 2, there is a solution. The solution is to have a spiritual experience. Now, Bill meant not an epiphany, not a bright light or burning bush experience necessarily, although that could happen, very seldom. He was really talking about that combination of many experiences with God. The awakening, therefore, of the Spirit and of the relationship that we have with our Creator. When the manuscript, which was first published in multilith, was distributed to the editorial committee, they decided, among other things, to change the 12th step. And what they did was to change the word spiritual experience to spiritual awakening. Now, because that was not the term that Bill had used, there is no explanation of that term anywhere in the Big Book. It's kind of left to our imaginations to understand what it is that that step is talking about. However, there are many, many clues as to what a spiritual awakening is. And so if we look at the Big Book and as a whole, which we must do, we'll find that the term spiritual awakening has some very definite meanings. It has those meanings which the Big Book addresses as being the results of working the steps. Naturally, if we're going to talk about a spiritual awakening as being the result of working the steps, then let's add together the other results which we have been told will come to us as we work the steps. We've got, for example, the whole panoply of so-called promises that follow the 9th step. But even more directly to the point, we know that we are going to have a number of things happen, and they're spelled out for us. For example, that we will enter the world of the Spirit. Now, this is as opposed to where we were back in the 4th step, where we found that we had been blocked from the sunlight of the Spirit. And now, by the time we reach the 10th and 11th steps, we have entered the world of the Spirit. Back in the 2nd step, we came to believe that God could restore us to sanity. We get to the 10th and 11th steps, we find that that has in fact happened, that we have been restored to sanity. That is, the obsession, compulsion to drink alcohol has been removed, and the insanities of the various defects of character have been removed, so that we have been restored to sanity. This is a part of the spiritual awakening. We also found that we were going to sense the flow of God's Spirit into us. That is, exactly what we were taught back in chapter 4, that we were going to find God deep down inside ourselves. It was only there that he could be found. And so another aspect of the spiritual awakening is that we have now become aware of God's Spirit flowing into us. In fact, for most of us, we come to understand that we are spirit, and God is spirit, and he is of us, and we are of him. Another aspect of the spiritual awakening is that we become God conscious. And of course, the 11th step talks about improving our conscious contact with our higher power. So part of the spiritual awakening is a God consciousness, the consciousness of God within, and the consciousness of our relationship with God. We also learn that we have developed what the Big Book calls a vital sixth sense, which means that now we have the ability, as a matter of grace and of gift to us, we have the ability to be inspired, to be intuitively instructed by God. And this vital sixth sense is that connection. And again, this is part of what the 11th step has admonished us, that we are to improve that conscious contact through prayer and meditation. We will also be aware, I think, that the spiritual awakening includes, for example, the coming of gratitude. And gratitude turns out to be an extremely important part of our recovery. As a matter of fact, you probably find that when your gratitude level is low, you are spiritually low. And when you're feeling very grateful, you'll find you're spiritually high. So if you're moping around feeling sorry for yourself and everything's wrong and everything's bad, it's a pretty good idea to see what's wrong with your spiritual condition. That's what I have to do. Another aspect of the spiritual awakening that we can identify is the coming of humility. Now, humility is something which Bill makes a major fuss about all the way through the book, and it's also a major function of the traditions, this whole idea of humility. And Bill equates humility with recovery in many different ways. And he wrote a whole article about it, something 7 or 8 pages, which we find in Language of the Heart. He made a big fuss about it in the 7th step, in the 12 and 12. But of course, that turned out to not be true, because the 7th step is not about humility. It's about asking God to take away our defects. So when we, and also, humility is oftentimes is a subject. People got to come up with a subject for a meeting, a topic. And then quite often what we hear all around the room is stories which really relate to being humiliated, or finding within ourselves the ability to begin to take responsibility for what's happened to us. But humility is really pretty simple. It's very simple. We learned that God has all power and all knowledge. Now, if that's true, what does that leave for us to be egotistical or prideful about? And once we understand that and accept that all knowledge and power is God's, and that whatever we receive as a gift, makes it pretty hard then for us to be taking a bunch of credit for ourselves. Humility is also the basic function of the traditions, although most people don't understand that. If you look at the 12th tradition, you will find that the 12th tradition is not based upon any pandering to fear. The 12th tradition is based upon the principle of self-sacrifice, which, read another way, means humility. What it really means is we don't use our last names because we sacrifice our desire for acclaim and for notoriety and for all of the good things that go with being identified as being some kind of a hotshot recovery person. And we take the last name and we put it aside and we don't use it in public. And the basic idea there is that we are practicing humility, and we are practicing in the spirit of self-sacrifice. We're sacrificing what our normal inclination and drive would be. So when we put all these together, and you can probably add more to the mix, we find what the 12th step calls a spiritual awakening. The awakening of our spirit, but it's more than that, because it connotes a connection between our spirit and God. And this is the vital part, this connection. It's what we have been working toward. It will also be obvious that because we have come this far with our steps, that we have reached a point of surrender, and that we are now willing to be obedient to God's will. And so, as we were taught back in the 5th chapter, we have to let go absolutely. And this letting go, this surrender, is something which has changed our lives. It also teaches us that if we are to remain sober and to grow spiritually, we're going to have to do whatever it takes to perpetuate this spiritual awakening and all that it represents. And perhaps the most important part of that is that we stay in a state of surrender, that we stay out of self. And we have numerous tools that we've been taught to use to do that. Especially we surrender each day as we go through the day. Thy will, not mine, be done. What do you want me to do next, God? What's my next step to be, God? Also, we surrender, and we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago. We surrender when we meditate. We let go during meditation. God is right there in the now, and that's where we find Him. But there's one other aspect of surrender which is perhaps the most powerful, because it seems to have the most lasting effect. And we find that right at the top of page 89, the first paragraph. Let's take a look at that. Practical experience shows that nothing will so much ensure immunity from drinking as intensive work with other alcoholics. It works when other activities fail. Now, this is a message which has gone all the way through the big book, and it continues on into the following chapters as well. It all started back there in the early days in November of 1934 when Ebby came to Bill's apartment and carried the message to Bill. And Bill was willing to listen to Ebby because he knew that Ebby was a drunk just like him, and Ebby had a lot of credibility as a result of that. Bill listened to him, and Bill paid attention, and then Bill started doing what Ebby told him to do, and it worked. If it hadn't, of course, none of us would be here, and a lot of us would be dead a long time ago. So the history of intensive work with other alcoholics begins right from the very beginning of our fellowship, and it permeates the entire big book, as it well should. In Bill's story, he makes it clear that if we're unwilling to do this, we're not going to survive. The way he put it is, if an alcoholic fails or refuses to enlarge and perfect his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he can't survive the certain low spots ahead. And that rule was back there in 1939, 38, and it's still the rule today. And so this matter of surrender, a large part of it has to do with our willingness to come out of self and into service with others. There are many other examples. For example, in the 10th step, that we resolutely turn our thoughts to someone we can help. In the 4th step, in the section of the 4th step dealing with our sex inventory, that we look for somebody we can help, that this quiets the imperious urge, when to give in would mean heartache. We're told in the 9th step that our real purpose here is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. And if you remember, when we did our 3rd step, where we began the process of surrender, we asked God to take away our difficulties so that the victory He gave us over those would enable us to be helpful to others by being an example to them of His power and His love and His way of life. And that prayer, that 3rd step prayer, is answered here in the 12th step. It is here that we gain the power and the opportunity to carry this message to others. And among other things, this spiritual awakening allows us, if we wish to be an example through our actions of God's power in our lives and His way of life and His love. So all these things tie together. This business of surrender then comes down to this: am I willing each day to do the things I must do to stay in a state of surrender? So I have the tools. It's up to me to use them. If it's to be, it's up to me. And the beautiful part about that is that if we are willing to be disciplined and consistent in using those tools, the results are uniformly excellent for us. Our whole life changes, and it stays changed. Now, there are other aspects to the 12th step. We've looked at the spiritual awakening. And that is a result of these steps. Do you see in the 12th step any alternative to working the steps? If we desire a spiritual awakening, which is the great gift, Bill called it the greatest gift of all, then how do we go about achieving that? Do we do that with group therapy, or with psychoanalysis, or by Texas two-stepping, 112, 112, any of that stuff? No. The spiritual awakening is the product of working the steps with a good heart and following the directions in the big book. That's exactly what it's telling us. Remember again that this big book is a history, not philosophy. It's not opinion. It's not something that was made up. It's a recitation of what happened to the people who started all of this, those first 100. They're saying, this is what happened to us. We worked the steps as they're laid out here. The directions are here. We've carefully followed directions, and as a result of that, we had a spiritual awakening. And they're saying, we believe if you do what we did, you will also have a spiritual awakening. And they were right. That's what does happen. The second part of the 12th step talks about carrying this message to other alcoholics. That also was changed by the editorial board, or committee, or gang, whatever you want to call them. Because Bill originally wrote that we try to carry this message to others, especially alcoholics, and they cut out to others. It was a compromise, and it was too bad that they did that, but some of them were thinking, we don't want to leave any leeway in here to go off in other directions. We're going to stick with singleness of purpose. But the big book itself, over and over again, admonishes us that we are to carry this message to others, that we are to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. We ask God to take away our defects, which would block us from being having maximum effectiveness in carrying His message and doing His will. Over and over again, the same message appears in every place except the 12th step. And again, it's just a product of a red pencil job or a blue pencil job by the editorial board, without apparently giving any thought to how do we back this up and how does this comport with the rest of the book. And so it becomes really, really clear after we've been doing this stuff for a while that these 12 steps are not our exclusive property, that they are not meant exclusively for alcoholics, but the contrary, these 12 steps work for everybody, every single human being. That's natural that they should, because these are spiritual principles which are universal in nature. These principles came about long before there was any formal idea about this class of humans called alcoholics. They've been around forever. And those principles apply to all human beings. And the 12 steps take those principles and put them into a usable form. That is, action that we take to make the principles a part of our lives. That's why the steps work. We get to live the principles rather than simply talk about them or think about them or sermonize about them or lecture about them or write books about them. We live them. And we do that in accordance with the last part of the 12th step, which is practice these principles in all my affairs. Now there is some confusion around the fellowship these days about what that means, these principles. And ever since those guys in Texas decided to sit down and identify the principles behind the steps and send those into the grapevine, the grapevine was stupid enough to publish them, and now everybody memorizes them, and it's absolutely wrong. The steps are the principles, and everything in the big book points precisely to that. When it says practice these principles in all of our affairs, it means the steps. The steps are the principles are the steps. They didn't even do a very intelligent job, but it doesn't seem to matter, because if there's a list of things to memorize and people memorize them, and then it always comes back as if you can just spout this stuff off and you sound so wise. But remember that you cannot have a principle behind a principle. Principle as far as you go. That's the rock bottom. That's, if you excuse the expression up here in Boca, that's the bottom line. Now, because that's so, if we can keep it very simple then, that last part, the third part of the 12th step, means that I'm going to work the steps in everything that I do. That's what it means. Practice these principles in all my affairs. Lots of people love to take shots at the word practice and all that stuff. I would suggest that we don't fall into those traps. Practice means the same thing as it means for a doctor. He practices medicine. Now you might say, I've met a lot of doctors who were still practicing. And it's certainly going to be true of the general public's opinion of lawyers. They're still practicing and not getting very far with their practice. But nevertheless, that's not what that word means in this context. It means to work, to use these principles in all my affairs. And that's exactly what we've already learned. If we take a look at the 10th and 11th steps and the 12th step, we find that the combination of those three steps incorporates every other step. Clearly, by direction, every other step is included, which means that as we go through the balance of our recovery and our spiritual growth, we're going to be using the 10th and 11th and 12th steps every day. And as a result of that, we're going to be practicing all of the steps every day. Practice these principles in all my affairs. Now that's not explained in chapter 7 at all. It's not even addressed. Carrying this message to other alcoholics is something which is addressed here, but not in the sense of sponsorship. We would like to think, for example, that the 7th chapter would instruct us as to how to be a sponsor, but it doesn't. One of the reasons for that, guys, is there were no sponsors when this was written. The word sponsorship doesn't appear in the big book. It might be in some of the 4th edition stories. I don't know. I haven't checked for that. But they didn't have sponsors when the book was written, at least not by that name. There were only a few of them, and everybody worked with everybody else. if you were in the hospital in Akron and it was the middle of winter and the snow was 10 feet piled along the roadways, you could still expect that these 10 or 12 or 15 people in the Akron group would come by to see you, even if they had to walk a couple miles in the snow to get there. That's what they did. Ever since Ebby and Bill with Bob, and Bill and Bob with Bill D, they knew that the secret to recovery was one alcoholic working with another. It had nothing to do with this mob stuff. Meetings were a place where people supported each other and exchanged ideas, and where newcomers could come and be loved and be welcomed into the society, and where people could pair off because they realized, and it was a rule then, and it really is still a rule now, although we don't seem to recognize it, that it is the one-on-one where the work is done. One alcoholic sharing with another. If you've ever been involved in the mass attack on a newcomer after a meeting, you'll know what I'm talking about. Here's one shaky, scared little newcomer standing there, and 10 old-timers standing around bombarding this poor person with everything, and a lot of it contradictory, and each one trying to outdo the other as to who was really Miss or Mrs. or Ms. or Mr. AA. And that doesn't work. I think I told you about that bunch in Chicago, the way they do it. Did I? Meeting there. 2 newcomers came in. Immediately, the meeting split in half. Half the room got up, grabbed these newcomers, and dragged them to another room. And I don't know what they were doing to them in there. And the other half stayed and did a regular meeting. I said, what's going on? They said, well, this is our custom. When there's a newcomer here, we do a first step on them. I said, what do you mean we? Half the group? Oh, yeah, that's the way they do it. So I don't know. They were still beating on those 2 people when we left, so I don't know what was going on in that room. Rubber hoses, maybe. What do you mean you thought you didn't know this was an AA meeting? What do you think, it was a bingo game? You know, that kind of stuff. God. Admit it, you're an alcoholic. That didn't work for Bill. That's why he couldn't get anybody sober for the first 6 months. Oh, you're really a drunk, aren't you? On your knees, fella, and start praying, you know. So anyway, I don't know what they were doing back there. So we've got then some ground to make up here. Now, what is the 7th chapter actually about? And what's it going to do for us? Well, at first it talks about the need to carry the message, and we read part of that. And then it's going to instruct us as to how we work with a newcomer. Now, this is very good stuff. This chapter has some wonderful stuff in it. And let me tell you that this chapter is if we trace it back in the history of the fellowship, we find that it really, the first 6 or 7 pages here are, you can see the fine hand of Dr. Silkworth all the way through. Because see, Silkworth was watching what Bill was doing out there for those 6 months, and Bill was coming into his hospital and trying to get some of his hopeless cases sober. And Silkworth got a good look at what Bill was doing, and he also, because he had had a lot of experience with Bill, and he'd had him in his hospital 3 times, he came to the conclusion that at the end of the 2nd time that Bill was in that hospital, and Silkworth took him and Lois aside, and he was going to release Bill that day. And he said, here's the truth of it, Bill. You are an alcoholic, a chronic alcoholic, and I can do nothing more for you. You have a disease, and it is invariably fatal, and there's no known cure for it. And I can't help you. The only thing that's going to save your life is if you stop drinking. And he said, if you don't stop, you'll be dead within a year. And looking back on that, Silkworth said to himself, and then he passed this along to Bill. He said, I'm convinced now that putting the sledgehammer to you that way softens you up enough that when you had somebody to talk to that you could have confidence in, that you could believe them, it made you ready to listen. And so he said, Bill, when you're trying to help somebody new, you're going to have to let them know what's wrong with them. Give them all both barrels. Make sure they understand what's going on here. Got to soften them up. They got to understand that this is not a matter of willpower or bad luck or any of the other things that they've been hoping for, but that it is a disease. He also told Bill that you're going to have to create some kind of believability with a newcomer. They're going to have to believe you. They're going to have to feel that you're credible, that you know what the heck you're talking about. Well, Bill took all of this to heart, and this was about 6 months after Bill had gotten out of the hospital the last time. He'd had no success whatsoever. And he was really getting desperate, as was Lois, because he kept bringing these bums home, and they were making a shambles out of his house. One of them tried to burn it down, and they would steal from him, and they were just using him, and he wasn't able to get anybody to follow him. So at the end of the 6 months, when he was talking to Silkworth about this, he took it to heart. Dr. Silkworth was a particular hero of Bill's. And when Silkworth talked, Bill listened. He also could remember back now to last November when he was sitting with Abby, and he realized that because Abby and he had been drinking buddies for 20 years, and he knew that Abby was about to be incarcerated for life as a chronic alcoholic, and had suddenly been released from this, and here he was sober 2 months later. Bill knew that Abby knew what he was talking about. He certainly knew what it was to be an alcoholic, to be powerless over alcohol. And so therefore Bill was willing to listen to Abby, and that was, and with his other knowledge that he was not dealing here anymore with a matter of willpower or cutting back or stay dry for a while and then you can drink again, or any of the stuff that he used to think. That he was dealing with a life and death situation for himself, what Silkworth had impressed upon him. And Bill, thinking back, was able to see that that's exactly what had happened. It had softened him up. It had made him ready to admit his defeat. And so it was with that in mind that Bill went to Akron, failed miserably in a business venture. That evening ended up in the Mayflower Hotel with the bar on one side and going to his room on the other, and he desperately wanted to drink. But God had other plans for Bill Wilson. In front of him was this message board, and on that message board were the names and phone numbers of several churches, local churches, with the pastor's name and the phone number, or the phone number of the church office. And Bill it came to him right then, I'd better see if I can find somebody to work with. He picked a number at random off that board. Some people say it was the minister of the local Oxford movement. I'm not sure whether that's true or not. Maybe it's an apocryphal story, but in any event, he called that number. Now, you stop and think about the slender thread upon which all of this hung. That particular minister happened to be acquainted with Henrietta Sieberling, the heiress to the Sieberling tire fortune. And when Bill called her, she happened to be acquainted with Dr. Bob and was willing to set up a meeting between Bill and Dr. Bob. Now then, when Bill went to Bob's house and began to talk to him, all the seeds of the first 6 or 7 pages of chapter 7 were laid, because it was at that time that he first used what Dr. Silkworth had told him. And that became the standard method of working with somebody new. Now, if you've ever wondered when you're sitting in the room and you got somebody new has identified themselves, if I were to talk to this person, what do I say? And a lot of us turn tail and run because we don't know. We're afraid. We don't know what we would say. We don't know how to work with somebody, especially if they're brand new and they're maybe still shaky. All we got to do is read the first part of chapter 7, and it tells us exactly what to do. And we're going to be studying that today and probably next Sunday as well. Now, in the meantime, we have to pay the rent, and I'm going to pass the hat here. Angie? Stretch for it, Shorty. And then after that, we'll take a 10-minute break. Be back in your seats in 10 minutes, please. Put money. Put money. Wait a second, I hadn't put any in there yet. Don't run off.
Have you met?
Yeah. She gave me a cookie. Hi, how are you? Probably I think it's in Delray. It's in her house. No. Is it going to be on the beach or is it going to be in your house? Is it going to be on the beach?
It looks ever so good.
Yeah, it's my favorite. I sat down. I like it. It's a little shot. I don't think it's mansion.
We're not going to have to be on the beach if it's raining, are we?
Huh?
We have to sit on the beach if it's raining?
No, we go inside the house.
Did I do good last night and shared?
Yeah?
Yeah?
I thought it was wonderful. That's a nice meeting, isn't it?
Yeah, I was making fun of Tom. I said, Tom, you must give me the CD I spoke. I'm just kidding.
Okay, well, he's got to get a release from you first.
Are you coming? If what? It is on a beach. And there's a restroom there too.
A restaurant or
A restroom.
How long are you going to be doing that for?
As long as Jim wants.
We have Lamaze class tonight, our second one.
Oh.
I wish I could come. Thank you anyway.
My girlfriend had her newborn and she loves it.
Well, we'll do it if people want it, you know.
It's like
If anybody shows
Got a
up.
family function I got to run to,
That's what
but
you gotta do.
Well, I don't know whether we're going to let that happen.
I'll see you during the week.
Okay. Are you coming down? You coming down tomorrow with Gretel?
Yeah, I'll take a ride down there with Fred.
2 o'clock?
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of money in here.
I was thinking about that.
Really?
And they actually like planned for their life. They know
There are some people want to keep this going.
I need to keep it on because I can't make it 8:30. I can't make it 8:30 Thursday night. That's my bedtime.
You doing that at the 441?
No, I didn't.
Well,
Bottom line.
That's the bottom line on Thursday, 4:41 on Friday.
Friday.
Friday, what time?
I don't know, I think it's 7.
Starting this Friday?
Yeah.
Sponsorship, right?
Huh?
About sponsorship?
Yeah, sponsorship workshop.
over there.
We make rent there?
And then
Good.
I flew up, a friend of mine found it.
We did.
She's nailed down 5 times. Stuff the street for my granddad. And about 5 minutes later, my son was great. When is that?
Somebody told me they
Yeah. I had it in a room, now I have. I don't like the artificial city. No. You could shift your chatty catch. I used to make it. So that one. The sugar, I need 2 grams. But the whole of it.
It's not the same.
I mean, every hour, 4 hours.
Every other month.
So I don't get to get together.
I mean, but that's.
Sugar-free.
I mean,
I don't mind low fat. I don't mind low fat.
God forbid I should leave my house. I think that's part of the order.
I like it. It's not as I'm gonna run to the
Don't run.
That's a good idea, because I cannot sit down. Or that one of the.
Try this.
Before you leave, I want to take
My job.
Is that a juice bar? I forget you don't do much better.
Look, this is, you know, Bill's story.
Yeah.
That's when he goes to Winchester
Every year. Every year.
It comes up for him.
Cottage that You saw that?
No, Evan took the picture of
If
that.
you ever wanted to do this during the week, in the morning, but nobody can do that.
It's not exactly, look at the beginning of Bill's story. It's not exactly.
No, but my son's gonna
Just saying that. Today is what? No, 8.
Oh, it is?
Yeah. No, Friday was the 6th.
Really? In the bad spot. I needed all my teeth. So I got it in the set.
Yeah,
So did everybody like
I told him, I said, I gave you my heart, I gave you my mane, you took off my hair from your shins. That doesn't sound like a hillbilly song. And he, because he was at the 4:30, and he was like, wiping his car, you know, his new Lincoln. So I said, Chinese. I said, you still, managing properties or whatever it is.
Story when it talks about, I mean, it doesn't say his name.
Well, if I can work out, they can always do a limousine service to you.
I think you're right about that. Well, you can't think of the
So he was next day with Dr. Batson.
I kept her
That's
well,
all
I
right.
will.
He's so good. And then he came, I got pictures of like in the kitchen with the coffee pot. He got so of course, me with the coffee pot.
And where'd you get them? And
And I still don't know what it is.
over there here.
I have no idea what the hell it is. First I went to the beginning of the development. Yeah. You know, I said, Carol, is this right?
Sharon, this pillow is like awesome.
That's what, I just remember me.
How are you? Good. How are you?
Ask the half measure group to come in, will you?
You want to do the secretary?
Sure, I'll do it. Should we make room?
Yes.
Good.
I'll leave you with this.
Well, they smoke there, they smoke there.
Okay, let's go to page 89, please.
You don't like me making reports.
Huh?
You don't like secretary's reports, do you?
Oh. Sure I do.
Or is it me?
And here you are sitting right in front of me, too. How can I...
I know.
Honey, it's just a senior moment. Please forgive me.
Sharon, all the troubles are you're making.
Okay, guys. We have a secretary's report from our dear Sharon.
Hi everyone, my name is Sharon. I'm an addict and alcoholic.
Please. We have one more book up here if anybody's doesn't have their book with them.